this year.
Everybody gonna get crab fever and then
I
we'll
think,
see snow.
I think the crabs are gonna get up my whole ass before anybody gets pot on board. Yeah. I'm worried about that. We ain't never had it this warm this early.
Is that your barge?
Y'all expect 47 now? Y'all expect?
That one in there.
What's that?
Drive over to
Andrew.
the Eastern Shore.
He texted me. I guess he's gonna call in.
So, Washington, what you doing?
Yeah, Pat Darn, Deep Rock. And Bay. I get 3 days in, 4 days a week sometimes. Got 3 in this week. I probably won't go tomorrow, and I gotta go back to Richmond Tuesday, so. What you
They had a stack of them one day.
Yeah, I didn't go this week, though. I've been sitting deal on that.
Oh, you did, okay. Okay.
Oh, boy, we are really on them.
Pretty sure we all said that.
Okay.
Is it from?
Last meeting,
Hey, sir.
I can sit down.
I can't believe Peyton ain't here.
Do what?
Peyton Mason, I said, he's not here.
Here?
I haven't seen him yet.
COVID either, has he?
No, I don't think so.
I haven't heard from anyone not coming, so I think maybe give folks a couple more minutes
that's
on the
fine.
phone.
That's okay.
See Peyton. Richard, I know he's not coming. Yeah, he's gonna call
Okay.
in.
Thank you.
Hey, Jackie,
Hey, JC, how
how
you
you doing?
I think Dan should be calling in too, so. Stop sharing there for a second.
I guess rockfish prices are pretty good, ain't they?
So.
And fish?
Can't catch those sea nettles.
That's what they tell me.
Closing that right up.
Them old red sea nettles. I see some of them in Baton Rouge too. Damn. Always something, man.
I'd heard that.
Is that you, Dan? Or is that Cody?
That's Rich.
Oh, it's Rich. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, I guess if you found it, it probably means other folks can. So, I didn't mean any. I didn't. No offense by that one. Just means we sent out the right,
Sure.
right contact information. So. I think we could probably get started if you want, a couple minutes after, and we can do introductions, and maybe they'll show up by then if that works for you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the, the February 16th SMAC meeting. I think we're going to be discussing the start the replenishment. And before we get into things, I would like to start with an introduction of just the ones on the panel here today. We'll start from my left here.
Tommy Kellum, Weems, Virginia.
Ben Johnson, Suffolk.
Lake Cowart, Plattsburgh, Virginia.
Wayne France, Westmoreland County, Virginia.
A.C. Hudgens, Matthews, Virginia Watermen's Association.
John Porter, Saxes.
Jackie Shannon, Chesapeake.
On the phone?
You hear that?
Rich Hardy, Reedville.
Okay.
Is that it?
I think that's all we have on the phone at the moment, so.
All right, well, thank you.
Dan not on there? You hear it?
He was planning on calling in,
Yeah,
but
he told me last night he was.
All right, I guess our next order of business will be the approval of the agenda.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't even,
Need a motion to accept the agenda.
so moved.
Have a motion to accept the agenda. Need a second?
Second.
Have a second? Paul?
I'll second.
I was going to call the roll.
Oh,
Is that okay?
Great, yeah.
All right, all those in favor of approval, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Abstentions? All right, the agenda approved. And I guess our next order of business will be the approval of minutes. I think everybody's had a chance to look at the minutes. Are there any additions or deletions to the minutes? Not hearing any, I'll accept a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any other discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed? Thank you. Opposed? Abstentions?
Abstained because I wasn't at the last meeting.
One abstention, Mr. Coward. Motion passes. All right, thank you. Proceeding with the agenda, I will turn this over to Mr. Button, a discussion of the OSHA Restoration and Replenishment Plan.
all right, thank you, Mr. France. So I think everyone up here has done this at least a couple times. So just going to go over a little bit of background, sort of what the plans are. Nothing momentous from what we've done for a number of years. Go over the funding for this year, and just to sort of simplify things, we'd approved some pretty significant projects last year that we're just going to be finishing up this year, but those were already approved by the last part of the last ORP, so we haven't included those. This is just new projects and new funding this go around. But just so you all are aware, that's just some ongoing restoration work, primarily in the York River. So that's going to be wrapping up this spring. We had a little hurricane come through that delayed us there. So this is mostly what we're going to be looking today for the oyster replenishment plan is mostly fiscal year 2024 funding, with a little bit of a start this spring with some funds that we currently have. But I'll get into that now with a little bit of background. All right. Just so folks kind of know where we are season-wise, we'll have this for background for this agenda item as well as any season extensions. But what you're looking at here on this graph is the harvest history off public and private ground going back to 1957-58. So that's when we really have pretty decent data on this. You can see the last time we were sort of in the area of harvest where we are now was in the late 80s, right before that pretty significant decline that we really didn't start to recover from for almost 25 years. So we're sort of back up at those harvest levels off public ground and private ground, in that 200 to 300,000 bushel range. So this is the last 22 years where we are, and that dip that we see in that 2020, 2021 timeframe, a lot of that is related to that COVID impact that we saw, as well as sort of at that point in that 2019 timeframe is when we did do some season shortenings to compensate for that freshet that we had in 2018 and that sort of high levels of harvest that we had. But again, pretty stable in that long-term average for the last 5 years. It's similar to the long-term average going all the way back to 57, 58 season of around 250,000 or so bushels of harvest per year off public ground. So that's that long-term average, and we're back at that level. It does look like we'll likely have, probably when all things are said and done, one of the best seasons in terms of amount of harvest that we've had in a long time when the 2022, 2023 numbers are in. Just for reference, this is sort of a multifaceted breakdown of where our oysters come from. This is not cumulative, but this shows that top blue line is the sum of all oysters harvested, market-sized oysters. This blue line here, so that's everything together. This is right here what's considered, or what I call, wild or traditional harvest. So this is harvest from public and private ground. That is, someone's got a little bit of echo if they're on the call in there, but this is harvest from public and private ground caught with traditional gear types, so primarily dredges and scrapes. This is total private right here. So that's containerized, hatchery-based harvest, as well as that traditional gear harvest. Wild private, again, this is just that portion off of private that's primarily nature-based, includes some spat on shell, but that's shell planting, seed movement, caught primarily with dredges. This public ground, again, is just the public harvest. So again, these aren't all cumulative, is that blue line there. And you can see that the wild harvest off of private ground and the wild harvest off public ground do tend to track pretty closely together. And then what you're seeing here in red at the very bottom is containerized aquaculture. So your bottom cages, floats, bags, that sort of thing. And this is based on VMRC mandatory harvest reporting data for the calendar year, not the season. Just a little background for when we go through these slides. You're going to be looking at some graphics that are depicting densities of oysters per square meter. So this is just sort of a key that if you want to convert those to bushels, you can do some pretty simple math, and you take the density and you can convert it to bushels. It looks the exact same on these harvest graphs. They go up and down, but basically there's 49 liters in a Virginia bushel. There's 4,046 meters in an acre, and you just do some multiplication, you can come up with how many bushels of shell there are. But they look at the same on a graph, so we could give this information to you in density per square meter or bushels per acre, and it would look the same. But this is just so you have it in the background. Again, when you're looking at these graphs, something to pay attention to, particularly when we're talking shell planting, is that 5 and 10 mark on the scale. So the scale might jump around a little bit, but 5 liters of shell is important in terms of that area remaining productive. That's just, there's physically enough room for the oysters to attach at that. And 10 liters is a sort of a single layer of oyster shell thick on a square meter area. So that's just basically about 1 shell thick, 11 millimeters is when we're at that 10 liter mark. And that's really when you can take advantage of a spat set. There's just physically that much room for the spat to attach. And once you get below that, you're not fully capitalizing on the spat that are available. So that's sort of the minimum is to keep things at 5, and the goal is 10 or higher. And again, on oyster densities, basically we've seen that in a lot of these areas, when you get 5 market oysters per square meter, that area can usually support a patent tong fishery. And at 10 market oysters per square meter or higher, those areas, if the water depth is appropriate, can people are catching a limit there with hand tongs. So again, those are 5 and 10, important for shell volume as well as oyster density in terms of what gear could be employed and limits caught. This is hot off the presses, 2022 data included in terms of the average density both of brown shell and oyster density per square meter for all harvest areas. So this is roughly the 10,000 acres that are surveyed annually between VIMS and VMRC, sort of an aggregate to give you a snapshot of the whole bay. Again, this green line right there is right at 10. What you're seeing here is for the first time in a long time, both in 2021 and 2022, we've actually had a bay-wide average brown shell volume that's getting pretty close to that 10-liter goal. So there are some areas that are below that, but in terms of the amount of, again, brown shell is both live oysters and shell that's available for recruitment. On a bay-wide scale, we're actually getting close to sort of that target in the areas that are surveyed. So that's a good thing. That means that these areas have, yeah, go ahead.
Andrew, is the rock that we've been planting counted as round shell, or how is that counted?
Yes, the actual physical stones, you mean? Or, yeah, those we count if they're above the surface of the mud. We count them as brown shell. We also take a measurement that we don't show in these graphs of any sunk shell, and we include sunk rock with that. So that's sort of a separate measurement that we take. But this is both live oysters of all sizes and shell that's exposed for recruitment is what brown shell is. And again, you can see that the number of market oysters in 2022 has actually increased slightly from 2021. So on average, some of these areas are now, above that 10 market per square meter threshold there, which is a good thing to be seeing. And what the replenishment plan in most of these harvest areas or sanctuaries is really trying to do, I know I touched on it a little bit there about that 5 and 10 liter threshold, but what you're looking at here is sort of composite of all some 1,600 samples that we take every year in the spat set and the shell volume. So you're looking at shell volume on the bottom right here and spat set on the top, and you can kind of see these points where below 5 liters you're not really, you'll get some spat, but we're not getting these spat sets where you're getting, over 100, over 200 per square meter. And again, at 10 is really when you have physically enough shell to really take care of a good spat set when you get it. So you don't really see these spat sets in the hundreds unless you get enough shell for them to physically attach to, and that's sort of at that 10-liter mark. So when there's a lot of spat out there, it doesn't really matter to that particular area if there's not at least 10 liters of shell there or more. And just to give you another visual, this is sort of a grab from a typical area after it's had extensive dredge harvest or a normal dredge season that we'd see. So this area is below 5 liters of brown shell. So this is 1 square meter hydraulic patent tong grab in an area that was scraped pretty heavily for a season. And that's sort of what the bottom looks like in an area that's been harvested sort of post-harvest. So that's probably a less than a 5 liters of brown shell volume is what if you were to take that piece of bottom and look at it, that would be pretty close to what it would look like. On the left-hand side, that's probably a 20-liter grab, so that's an area where there's more than 10 liters of shell. And then on the right-hand side, that's probably an area that's got about pretty close to 10 liters of shell, probably in that 8 liters or so range, maybe a little bit more. And that's sort of typical of what, on average, all our areas are looking like. Is there's some shell there, but not quite as much as an area that hasn't really seen any harvest activity when we're talking about non-sanctuary areas. So those are just sort of to give you a reference of what those grabs actually look like when we're measuring the brown shell volume.
Back to the previous slide, where was that taken?
That was in Mobjack, either toe steak or pulses. I'm not sure where that one on the right was offhand, but I believe the one on the left was one of the upper seed areas in the James River that hadn't had any harvest activity. So you see the oysters are sort of growing up in clumps and clusters versus kind of spread out that you see in some of those harvest areas or sort of.
Andrew,
Mm-hmm.
on that last slide shows the tongue, the tongue, is that the width of those tongues? That's not as wide as what ours are, and is that just because that's the way you all use it to measure?
Yeah, those are calibrated to be a square meter, so
Square
they're
meter, okay,
measured so we can do those calculations, and they're hydraulic, so you can see
Right.
they actually go down into the sediment, and they're pretty
Mine
much
are
getting
twice
everything
that
that's
wide,
under there.
yeah.
Yeah. And you see that gray basket, that's when we're actually doing the survey with VIMS, is all that shell's going in, and then all the oysters are counted, and those volumes of shell and those numbers of live oysters are coming from a lot of grabs like that. So some 1,400 to 1,800 of those
Okay.
every single fall. Again, this is sort of a close-up of just the brown shell volume that we were talking about across all areas, and you can see where, again, there are some areas that are below, some areas that are above, but on a bay-wide scale, we're getting close to that 10-liter target, which is a good place to see that keep going up, and you can see that's been sort of slowly ticking up, but the difference between, 5 and 6 and 9 and 10 is really when you start having the ability to get those good spat sets. So if we keep that shell volume higher, when there is a good spat set, we're going to be able to get 400 oysters per square meter versus 50 if we just had 5. And again, those are sort of generalizations, but kind of on average what we're seeing. Were there any questions on? Oh, I'm not sharing it? Okay. I thought I was there. There we go.
Andrew,
Mm-hmm.
when you take these samples, how do you delineate between soft Baylor survey and hard Baylor survey?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are they random samples, or do you go to the hard, good bottoms and take samples, or do you take it all over?
We go to the areas that have been either identified as sort of historic reefs, so actually, the actual rocks that people are working on, and those are the areas that we sample, as well as the areas that have been planted with shell, either recently or historically. So most of the areas that get shell plants are surveyed, but not every single piece of Baylor in an entire harvest area. So in a given season, there's probably 70,000 acres of bottom that's physically open to harvest. But as we all know, most of that people aren't actually harvesting on, but the survey is roughly 10,000 acres of the actual, sort of historic named oyster rocks that people work on.
So you're surveying on the hard rocks?
Right.
Survey.
Yeah, the majority of it. I mean, we might have an area that, some of them are a little patchier that we might survey in, but we are primarily on the identified oyster rocks that are either planted or worked.
Andrew, do you anticipate the money budget-wise to be about the same as it was last year?
That's my next slide.
Okay.
Were there any other questions on sort of the background?
Yeah. Those tongs, when you throw them over and work them, do you work them in the bottom, or you just drop them and shove them together?
Well, they're
This one right here doesn't look like good hard rock to me.
this one here.
No.
Or this
the
one
to your
here?
right. It looks like
Look how long the
just the
teeth are.
shells, and it looks like
Twice as long as mine.
just gray shells that are in the mud. It does. I know.
Well,
at
a lot
home,
of the good hard rocks-
A good hard rock will look like the one on the left.
Prior to harvest, yeah, but a good hard rock will look just like this after it's been worked by 70 boats for 3 months. So this is what, after shell rock had 70 boats on it before, a lot of the bottom looked like this. So this is an area that might have had 10 liters before it was harvested, and this is what an area that has good hard rock looks like, the actual physical bottom. And it looks very different in a dredge, but this is what the actual bottom would look
I was
like.
just wondering if you were working them tongs down so far, you were getting underneath of the brain shells. 'Cause
We
I know
do,
with
yeah,
flat tongue,
yeah.
You can do that.
Well, these are...
Our tongues won't do it, but they will.
They will, because they're hydraulic.
Right. So this isn't just scraping the top off into a brown lump of shell. This is, those weigh probably 200 pounds, and they have a hydraulic close,
Yeah.
and they go down hard. And
What I'm trying to say is if you're on a good hard bottom, they
Mm-hmm.
won't go down as far, I wouldn't think. But if you're on it just like a mud lump, we called it, which,
Mm-hmm.
brain shells on top and fairly soft underneath of it, that's what that looks like. But
well,
to me.
if we're on good, like if it was say rock hard sand, those are some areas where you may have issues with them maybe closing, but for the most part, being hydraulic and being as heavy as they are, if there's oysters growing there, they're going to get all the way under, unless it's actually some of the rock plants that we've done where we had a special, even heavier set of tongs built. But these are the ones that we've been using for this survey for 30 years, same pair of tongs. So it's all pretty consistent. And
One more question. When are you gonna start using the dredge?
we do use a dredge.
Oh, you do?
We do an annual dredge survey, not of all the same areas as we patent tong, but again, the dredge tends to give you what's called
A good look.
a good look. No.
Looked good down there this year when we dropped it.
It's
but anyway.
a dredge makes almost with like that area that you see on the right. If you were to drag a dredge across it, it would probably look great. where it looks a little less great when you're actually looking at what the bottom is. In a dredge, it's a lot harder to determine how many shells are actually there. You can just kind of determine how quickly you can fill your dredge up with oysters and shell and sort of do a percentage of what's live, what's dead on that area, but it doesn't actually tell you how much physical shell is on the bottom, which is what we manage on.
Did your recent look at Area 4 show that it was a lot less boats on it than it had been in historical surveys after post-harvest?
In terms of the amount of shell,
Just overall.
Area 4, what we just recently did in terms of the number of boats working there.
Yeah,
With,
have you looked at it post-harvest?
we did look at it, not after the last 10 days, but we did look at it after this most recent harvest, but after the first month and a half. And the shell had dropped about, I don't have those numbers right here in front of me, but it went from about 14 liters of brown shell to 8 in that month and a half with roughly 50 or so boats working on it.
So I guess where I'm going is, I mean, it was not nearly the boats that's been on that historically at one time. Could you tell?
You definitely could tell, and I'd have to go back through the numbers, and we've probably done some post-harvest surveys after more boats have been on there, but yeah, a lot of these areas in the Rappahannock, I think post-harvest have seen that shell dip below that 5 liter threshold after harvest, and based on before that 10-day further harvest that we had, we were still at 8 liters of shell versus below 5. So you could tell that it hadn't
And
had
good
the
news
same
is,
effort.
I think Wayne could attest, I don't think it got too much pressure this last
No, it
10
didn't get too
days.
much
It
pressure.
was, it was a good decision that the commission made, but I think,
Yeah, I think you were right. It was time to close it, I think.
No, we went out there, I guess, the week before last, and there was about an Area 4 between Ferry Rock all the way up to Coratoman, maybe 9 or 10 boats, and the other boats, 40 or so, had moved to Area 2. So.
went out and took a look there this second tranche of the harvest, and, it still looks as good historically. It just looks so much better than 10 years ago or what have you, even post-harvest as to what I'd seen.
It definitely is.
It looks better than it had at the opening in some years, and that's a good thing. But
No, it definitely, I mean, a lot of these areas, when we were opening them in the Rappahannock, had oyster densities of 5 or 10, and when we opened them this last go-around, they had 10 to 20, even some of the scrape areas. And, we still half the number of markets there, but half of 20 is still a lot more than half of 10. Even I can do that math.
So Andrew, when we go from 14 liters down to 8, that's 6 liter difference there. Is that counting the markets that have been taken off?
That's correct, yeah, as well as any smalls that have kind of been pushed off, or any smalls that, there's 10% tolerance on small oysters, so any of those as well that have gone or have made it to market size since our survey. So and shell that's been covered over, is when you sort of knock over these areas with a dredge, that brown shell can become black shell, and then that's not counted too. So that's where that volume decreases on the brown shell volume. It's a combination of the market oysters going, the shell either being physically moved off the rock or laying over because it's not a live oyster, or attached to a live oyster and becoming black shell, or sort of dissolving or getting ground up and degraded. So that's where the brown shell turns into black shell and isn't counted anymore. It's a combination of all those things.
So in the period between now and next fall, nothing happens. Those small oysters and spat grow. The amount of culture will increase.
We hope it works that way. Yeah. If it's not, there's usually something going wrong, but not all areas do that. If you're sort of below a certain threshold, or if you have recruitment problems, oysters, regardless of disease or anything else, do die. And if they're not actively growing, sediment's actively covering up and the shell's dissolving. So in a ideal world, if you get to that sort of 10 liter threshold, and you don't have disease, you don't have sediment, the bay, as it was 400 years ago, that reef would keep growing. But today, if you get a freshwater event, sediment comes down, harvest happens, all those things can cause even an area that's at 10 liters to decline, but it's much less likely to decline than an area that's at 5 liters and isn't getting shell planted on it.
So if you have an area like with 8 liters on it, like we're talking about now, do you recommend putting shell back on that, or as long as we're over 5 liters, kind of to leave it?
It's one of those things is we're at a spot this year where we're going to have some areas that are close, and like, these areas, we could put a lighter shell coating on them, get them sort of up to that 10 liter, we typically do 1,000 liters per square meter, which is a little bit more than that single shell's thickness, so we could do a little bit less. Or what we started to do, I guess last year, is areas like Manaskin Bluff and Island Rock in the Pocomoke, is when we had some budget, we had some extra shell because these areas were in good shape, we could go to some of these areas that, they're producing some oysters, but the shell really isn't there. They might be at that, right on that 5 liters, and they might occasionally get good recruitment, make those areas better. So that's when we don't harvest these areas that we've been maintaining for 30-plus years down to that 5 liter threshold. It allows us to have some shell left over to start looking at, instead of planting an area every single time after it's harvested. If we haven't had 120 boats working there for 2 months, maybe we can plant a little less shell and, make 40 acres in the Rappahannock or Pocomoke or wherever a little bit better.
I'm sure we could continue to just ask you questions on this until
I got
until
one thing to
tomorrow.
say. Please don't put any shells on Shell Rock. We have a massive amount of oysters. Unbelievable. I've been doing this since it was open in the 70s. Other than that time, this is the best year. No comparison.
Well, definitely one of those areas is.
We can put some shells. You just give me a holler.
No, I'm hopeful that Shell Rock doesn't need any shells. I think there are. Just so everyone knows what we do is for the last 30 years we've been putting shell directly on top of every area that's open to harvest. So all these areas that have gotten to this point, not all of them, but the majority of them, when they get below that level, we add shell right on top of the live oysters. And I know there's been talk about covering up areas, and it does make it harder to go through it potentially if you get into, some reef shell versus just, a scattering of markets that's left there. But it's what we've been doing for the last 30 years, and it's in part the reason why we're here. So we try very hard to not cover up these rocks and to plant them at very light levels. It's the same thing you do on a harvest area. Once it gets down, you leave a little bit there. You're not getting rid of all your shell and starting over from scratch, but that's what we try to do to keep these areas maintained, including Shell Rock, which we put a lot of shell on, a lot of seed on.
We have, and we've got a lot of rock that needs shell. Everybody, you can talk to Dan. Dan, we've got plenty of rock there to put fresh shells on and make it bigger than what it is. And that's what I'd like to see. Shell Rock's got so many oysters on it now, it's unbelievable.
Well, you might be surprised what the patent tongs show versus what your dredge shows when you go out there.
Come up next year and we'll jump aboard the boat and go look at them again.
Yeah.
And I'll be the first one to tell you I was wrong, if I'm wrong.
No, again, it's one of those that there's probably areas where if you had 30 boats going around a buoy for 2 weeks and they didn't move, there's probably a spot where it looks like that. But you're right, there's probably plenty of spots where it looks closer to what's on the left there. And that's always hard to plan around. But I think that likely since it was in, Shell Rock was over 15 liters when we started. I think I'm saying that right. So it's probably gone down to in that 8 range at this point.
Trevises was unbelievable. I mean, all the boats been working on Trevises. I wish Dan was here, he could tell you. And I mean, we've caught as many oysters off Trevises as we have on Shell Rock. There's more oysters left on Shell Rock than there are Trevises. But anyway, go ahead, do what you got.
All right.
Give me a holler.
I am here, Andrew.
Oh, there we go.
There you
Dan's.
go.
Yeah. I've been here about 10 minutes.
Okay. You could have said you'd been here about 25, and we would have believed you.
Just get in.
All right. Were there any more before we get into the meat of it? Any more questions on how the survey works? Also, just so folks know that our colleagues from VIMS are here. If there's any questions and they're on the boat with us, this is a joint undertaking between the VIMS Molluscan Ecology Lab and VMRC. So this isn't a VMRC survey. This is a VIMS VMRC survey. You know, if the numbers are wrong, it's Missy's fault, I promise. No. But this is what we've been doing more or less for the last close to 30 years now. All right, so here's the money slide. So again, this is just funding that's going to be new. So we'd had a lot of that restoration funding the last couple cycles, but we have basically allocated that for projects that are already permitted. So we're not going to, unless folks want to spend time talking about where we're putting rocks. We've already been putting rocks for a while. This is the money that is going to be part of the 2023 funding. Most of it is going to be general funds, so I haven't seen any changes in any of the amended or proposed budgets. So there's $4 million in general funds available. $2.5 million of that is dedicated for replenishment or harvest areas, and $1.5 million is restoration funding. So folks may recall that in 2019 they increased funding for the replenishment side, but also added additional funding for restoration. Prior to that, what was considered replenishment was both harvest and sanctuary areas, but this sort of made a funding distinction and increased funding for the replenishment side and added those general funds for restoration. The Nature Conservancy has been for a number of years giving a grant to VMRC to do shell planting on the seaside of the Eastern Shore. It's likely that $125,000 will be available for seaside shell planting. And then non-general funds, this year primarily oyster resource user fees, up to $200,000 would be available. Roughly $200,000 to $300,000 comes in to that user fee fund annually, in that range here recently. And that's primarily what we use for the seed transport program, as well as all the other sort of day-to-day expenses of running the program. So no salary comes out of that, but it's what puts gas in the boat and gets us to the shell planting sites for the work that we do for replenishment. Were there any questions on funding for this year? Okay.
What will the total that you spend, including the federal funds for rocks and everything, what will the total for this year, replenishment, restoration, everything your department does?
Just got to say, which year? Federal calendar year? Federal fiscal year or state fiscal year?
I would say let's just say this summer, what you're going to,
Okay.
the work you're going to do in a traditional.
Right. So we'll probably have, we have our contract already for, I don't know, it's less than I don't know the number offhand. There's a couple 100,000 left for York River Stone. And then we have grant funding that was approved part of last year, about $750,000 for work in the Mob Jack. And those are the two big pieces of federal funding, and there's some capital funds left that we're going to expend towards both the Mob Jack and we'll be using the rest of that in New York. So ballpark it at maybe $3 to $4 additional million to finish up those restoration projects that were approved under previous funding.
That was out of that big block of 10 million or whatever it was that we had gotten.
Yeah, there was that 10 million capital funds, as well as a number of grant applications that we put in for. So we recently were awarded a $4 million 4-year grant for work in Mob Jack, and then we had a previous $3 million 3-year grant for work in the Piankatank and New York. But that funding has already been sort of allocated for those projects and approved as part of last year's plan. And again, I'll say it again for folks, is whenever possible, we try to use those restoration dollars to sort of piggyback on replenishment. So if we're using any of the any shells or any fine shells or any rocks, and there's an opportunity to mobilize in plant harvest areas at the same time we're doing sanctuary areas, we try to get sort of that economy of scale going and keep those costs down. So whenever we can use, I don't want to call it using money twice, but whenever we can make the most out of the funding that we have to support both replenishment and restoration, we try to do that. So if we have a larger replenishment budget, it can make restoration projects cheaper and vice versa. So we try to get, whenever we can, that economy of scale going whenever we're working in an area. So we usually start off with seed transplanting. So that's where I guess we'll start off again in this plan. So for a number of years now, I guess we're going on this will be the 5th year that is proposed. We've been moving seed from an area in the Nansman Ridge that has been planted with reef shells or fossil shells. So that was first planted in 2017, and we started moving some seed from there that year, and we've done sort of in the 10 to 20,000 bushels from there every year. And again, we'd propose doing that this year. Last year we had again, you might see up to 15,000 bushels there. Last year we had a request to include up to a certain number of bushels for seed from the hand-tong areas. And again, this tends to be more expensive. With the seed from Nansman Ridge, this area can be replanted for about $3 a bushel in terms of the cost of the reef shell, plus in that $6 to $7 range for transporting it. So we're usually able to both replant that area with reef shell, and move it for less than what it would cost to move seed from the hand-tong areas in the James River. But again, that option is available to us if there's folks, and if the committee would like to move less shell or less seed for more money, then we can look at doing that in the James River seed areas. But typically we're able to move more seed of a comparable quality and count, but it's more versatile and can go to higher salinity areas as well as lower salinity areas from the Nansman Ridge. And in the past, we've done that. But for some background on that, and just so folks know, this is James River seed areas, and you might notice sort of in 2018, 2017 time frame here, that was when close to 140,000 bushels came out of these areas. Most of that was being bought and transported out of state. Since that time, we've limited out-of-state transport of seed, and then more recently lowered the fall and spring quota to not be cumulative, and lowered those to 90,000 bushels total, with 30 being allowed to be caught in the fall and 60,000 being allowed to be caught in the spring. That's in place this year. Right now, there is no, the commissioner can do it at any time, but there is no prohibition on out-of-state seed transport now. But again, the seed areas in the James River have recovered from that freshet in 2018,000, largely, most areas, as well as that harvest increase that we saw. So there is good seed available in the upper James River this year. And some of it's pretty good size. So you can see again that freshet and that targeted harvest really targeted a lot of the larger oysters here. So that's that green number there, and actually the number of, and these are market size, not necessarily, full disclosure, marketable oysters. So they're over 3 inches, but they might be a little skinny. These are market size oysters in these seed areas in the upper James as of the 2022 fall survey. This is just the areas that were planted as part of this program in the Nansman Ridge area. And you can see that on average these areas are at that 10 liters of brown threshold, and there's not a huge number of markets there, but they have pretty good spat sets and pretty good small oysters. And again, this is on average. There's some areas there that are a little more struck up than others, but this is over these areas here. So this is the larger 200 plus acre Nansman Ridge area, and these are the areas where we would propose moving that seed from. And just for reference, this is where we dredge the majority of our reef shell from, so you can see why it's pretty inexpensive to plant it right there. The areas that we've planted in the past and I think have been working pretty well, we've seen good spat sets in these areas, and these areas are in pretty good shape, are in Upper Pocomoke. These areas are pretty hard to get the large shell barges to, but with the smaller boats that move seed, we can get up on top of these areas. They've been open to harvest this year. A lot of the areas sort of on the top of these reefs we can't actually get to on the shell barge. They're sort of in that I mean, 6 feet is on a good tide in some of these spots, and typically our tugboats that we use, we try to hold them to 7 feet or less, and the barges, you can tell them 6 feet, but if they have a low corner, it makes for a problem. So these areas are very difficult to plant with the large shell barges, and sort of limiting the amount of harvest pressure on them and then replanting them with seed has been an effective way to get them into pretty good shape. So I'd like to propose to do that again this year, probably in that 5,000 bushel range to areas 9 and 10 in Upper Pocomoke. Rappahannock River, again, these are areas 7 and 8 that we've been opening sort of concurrently, and we've been moving close to 10,000 bushels of seed up here. We might not quite do that this much this year, depending on the will of the committee. We might try to move more seed from the Nansman Ridge up here, and if we do any hand tong seed, that might be more appropriate for the Potomac tributaries. But 7 and 8 sort of, since they've been hand scrape areas and not hand tong areas, we've been able to plant that seed a little bit thinner up there, and we've also done some shell planting work. And again, this does have mostly smaller size oysters, but there might be some close to market size oysters mixed in there. So it doesn't hurt to plant this area thinly on top of areas that are going to be open to harvest in less than 3 years. And again, we've done, I guess, I think we're on our 4th year, maybe 5th year now of planting on sort of a rotational schedule in the Nominee, Yacomico, and Cone rivers. We took the Nominee a little bit early out of the harvest rotation and planted the Yacomico last year. You know, my understanding has been that the Nominee actually did produce a pretty good number of oysters this last go around, even though it was opened a little bit early. There had been some concerns with the seed not being as thick as we were anticipating it being in some of these areas up there, so we chose to open that area earlier in the harvest rotation cycle. So this is that problem could happen again, or it might not. So it's sort of an option. It is an area where oysters do grow very well and very quickly, but the committee had decided to open, and the commission voted to open that early and take that out of that seed rotation in the last go around, and we have explored planting some additional areas in the Yacomico and Cone. So that's an open for discussion in terms of where in the Potomac we'd like to continue to plant this seed. I mean, the Nominee is a great area to put it if it is what you expect when you go back to it. But again, this is an area that's doesn't get a very high spat set, and these areas would, if they're continued to be open to harvest, kind of decline as they're hand tongued up there if we don't put some seed back. I'll stop there, and we can discuss that and take motions if you'd like.
Andrew, from the people I've heard that tonged in the Nominee, say there are still a lot of small oysters in there. So that just may be a place we leave for another year and let those smalls get big enough, and they may have a good harvest next year on those. My concerns about Cone and the Yacomico, it seems like the big boat that comes in there with seed on it can't get up on top of the bars where you're planting that right now, like they should. I mean, they get around the edges, but they just can't get in there on those bars where the oysters do the best.
Well, I think, I guess I can't, there was one area where we did kind of plant off the edge, but if we time it on a tide, I think we have been able to get into some of these areas. I think we went out there with one of the harvesters when we were planting and made sure we were in the right spot. So I know some of the times off those edges, I'm not sure what happens, but we try our best to get right on top of as shallow as we can. But ideally, if we can find a tide when we have at least 6 foot of water is kind of what we need to try to get on there. Maybe 5.5, we can kind of get up to it. But if it's much shallower than that, it is harder to plant. So.
Lakey, do you have any comments on that, or have you heard anything to that nature?
We didn't buy many of the Cone last year, but what I heard the watermen say was there were a lot of small oysters going back overboard in Cone. But Honest Point is a good piece of bottom. We planted it maybe 4 or 5 years ago with our planter, which we can run in 3 feet of water. Big Bar or Great Neck, there's more water on that, I believe. And I know big boats, I know Jerry Pruitt planted up there some years ago.
Yeah, no, I think we've done some of those. Jerry actually is a smaller boat, but he draws a little bit more, and the Mob Jack is a little bit bigger, but unless they load it more, it draws a little less. So that is something that when we planted there, I think we tried to blow half the load off on Big Bar and then come over to Honest Point once we get it up again. So that's something that we can do in these areas. If there's a deeper spot, we'll try to plant that first and then catch the tide and get up on the shallower spot.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. That's just the only concern that I had and other people, had mentioned to me.
We'll try to give Clarence a call and make him come out there again with us and
Yeah.
make sure we're on the right spot. But if and again, if these areas are good, this is user fee money, so this is we can always put more seed somewhere else, or we can at least put a couple loads up here, maybe one or two in these areas rather than a full 5,000 bushels. So that's sort of what we'll be looking at.
Andrew, how much does the barge draw? Loaded.
Well, there's different barges and there's different loads. So if we put these larger barges, if we were going to somewhere in the Pocomoke, we can load them down to about 10 foot a draft, or so is sort of about. They can get more than that. I think maybe 12 is as much as we could load them down if they're really slam full.
I was just wondering about up on the old rocks, if we could dump half of it to Dogfish. I think my son told you we got enough boats there to pull that barge rather than let that tug go up there and destroy everything.
Yeah, no, we try to keep the tugboats off of them and use a smaller tug to get in there. But it's one of those, if it can, and you know how those spots are. There's some little lumps where it looks like it's 6 foot, and then all of a sudden there's a 4 foot spot. And
You get a low tide like we've been having here lately, and you probably walk across it with a pair of hip boots. But
Right.
anyway, just, trying to get shells up there cheapest way you could, and that's the cheapest way is a barge, but you can't get her up there,
Well, it would be nice if we had a couple small boats that could run some shell up there from these areas, but usually smaller boats and smaller shell piles means higher dollar amounts. So
I just wish there was a way you could transport them by truck, and get Jerry to come in there and load them and then carry them up. I don't know which is the cheapest way. I guess it's high every way.
yeah, no, it's one of those. If we can move seed up there for $750 and we're putting shell up there for $8, But I'm not sure what it would actually cost to. We can always put it out for bid and try too, but it's one of those. House shell is usually easier to truck too, but there's always a limited amount of that available to us. So with the reef shell, getting that out of the river onto a barge, onto land, back onto a barge, you're handling it that many more times. So it does get. We just need a shucking house over there in Saxes again, and we'd be all set.
I don't think you ever see it.
But is there any discussion or motions on seed? I know we talked about areas, just sort of like some direction from the committee on hand tong seed, Nansman Ridge seed, or any other areas.
That's what I was going to ask. How much, like last year, it was up to 15,000. Was any seed done on the Shaftonian end of it?
No, there was no one that was interested in doing that. So we left it at that 15,000 and didn't sort of roll that over into additional seed from Nansman Ridge. So the short answer is no.
All right, well, that was my next question. Does that get stuck with the Shaftonian if they don't do it? Or does it go up Nansman Ridge portion of the season? So that was my next question.
Well, I guess we're not, we try to set the price to where we get it, so there's no guarantee that we'd have, likely with that $200,000, that would cover that full 15,000. So I think we'd be comfortable with, again, maybe up to 20,000 bushels from that area. But I guess at the request of the committee last year, we dropped that down to no more than 15, regardless of what happened with the shaft tong seed. So that's you could make a motion if you wanted, Dan, but I can't. So.
Yeah, well,
Go ahead, Dan.
I I'll tell you the truth. I don't even know what I mean, I'm fine with doing this, what we done last year. I don't know if that would be, if that's up for discussion. I mean, I think with what we done last year, as far as the seed area is concerned, I'd be fine with that. I don't know if, I guess that's not an official motion, but, I'd be fine with that.
Well, let's have Andrew maybe go over and remind us of kind of what we did last year. If you don't mind, Andrew.
Sure. So, I think last year we did, close to that amount. We did almost a little over, right around that 15,000 amount, going out. So that was about 4,000 or so, maybe a little more going up to the, Yacomico, a little bit more than that going to the Pocomoke, and the balance, going up the Rappahannock. So we could hold it sort of about, 4 and 8, or if we want to make it even 15, 4, 4, and 7, in terms of 7 up the Rappahannock, 4 up the Pocomoke, and 4,000 or so up. And we might go a little over, a little under, but right about that is what we did last year.
Mr.
Well,
Cohen.
I will ask this before we go any further, and I know it seems like I come at this, but how many? I mean, everybody knows that when I speak about this, I'm after more bang for our buck. How many watermen are we? How many watermen is working this 4,000 up to the Potomac?
I think it varies from month to month, but
Come on, Andrew, give me an answer.
I think at probably at a high point there's probably 15 to 20 boats split up there, maybe a few more. So and a lot of those have 2 people per boat, not all of them, so 40 or so people. There's 200 boats total, I guess, roughly in the whole fleet. So. About 10% maybe.
And it will be like that until, hand scrape season comes in, then a lot of them will go hand scraping.
And I guess other thing is some of these areas, if they stay good, that might be 10 less boats that are hand scraping, and sort of it's cumulative. So you're looking at spending.
Well, I know that's one way of looking at it, Andrew, but we're putting the same amount of seed for 15 boats that we are in places. Rappahannock's getting a little bit more, which is fine. That's supplying a lot of boats. There's a lot of boats that work the Rappahannock. But I just, you're saying it's 10 boats that's not there, but if you put that money somewhere else, that could supply 30 boats. That's what I'm getting at. I mean, I've been through this, and I don't keep meaning to sound like a broken record, but I just don't. I don't know. I mean, sometimes it just, as the old saying goes, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. And I know there's been some money made up there, but I don't know if it's getting proportioned the way that it needs to be.
Well, I won't say one way or another, but these are areas that don't get anything but seed. So almost all the other areas are getting $2.5 million worth of shell every year spread between them, and we're talking about $60,000 worth of seed. So that's sort of the perspective.
I understand that, but
you are right. It is.
The Pocomoke has worked. I don't know what Don would say. I don't know if he's counted. I'd say it's been 60 boats anyway.
60.
Rappahannock, I'm sure. I mean, with all areas combined, I'm sure it's. I mean, I would say it's 60 or 70. I would think. I'm just shooting off the cuff. I've not been down there. I mean, it's. I don't know. I mean, it just seems like there's a lot of money goes up there for a handful.
And we had 51 boats in the harbor. In the harbor,
Well, we had
up on the
we had
trails.
17 out of here, and at most times 12 to 13 of us would be over there.
And I know 5 or 6 that are coming out of Deep Creek in that area, coming across.
That's sort of
So we had a lot
60,
of
70
boats.
most days. Yeah. No, and just so that you all kind of know where it is, we've done boat counts a number of weeks this season, you know, and the James has been in that 40 to 50 range in the hand scrape areas, and 2 or 3 boats up in the hand tong areas doing a little bit of seed. York River's had a dozen boats, 6 to a dozen boats hand tonging most of the year, and now sort of 6 to a dozen have shifted to hand scrape. The Rappahannock has had that sort of 50 to 60 boats, mostly hand scraping, and then somewhere 10 to 15 patent tonging, maybe some more, switching back and forth some years or some months. So that's sort of the breakdown. And then Great Wicomico, Blackberry, you know, no more than 10 to 20 most days, probably less than that most of the time. So that's sort of been the breakdown, and a lot of those folks started out in October, maybe into November, that 10 to 20 boats probably up in the Potomac tribs. And then there's been some shuffling back and forth, but that's sort of a breakdown of the roughly 200 to 230-ish boats that are working on any given day.
Mr. Cullum, you had your hand up a while ago.
I was just gonna say, going back to the hand tong seed, I think last year was a testament that, you know, that's starting to fall off the table. I mean, private industry had a struggle last year to get tongers for what little bit of seed we needed. So I think realistically, a number like that, I don't think it would even be possible to achieve. So that, I think we've got to look at a dredge seed resource to be able to get the numbers that Andrew needs for the quantities he just spoke of, wherever we put them. But
Yeah, I think you said if you can't get the tong seed, you can up the dredge seed a little bit, or?
We could do that. We could say up to 20,000 bushels of dredge seed, if the committee's comfortable with that. If we don't get that up to 10,000 bushels, that's sort of where we're at there. You have a question there?
Is Deepwater Light still a replenishment area?
It is, yes. Yeah.
Is that an option?
We haven't discussed that, but it is an area where, you know, it is a replenishment area. Mostly it's been open to hand tonging, not dredging up there. You know,
I mean, would that take any great regulation change to put a state boat up there dredging seed?
It's something we could look at. It wouldn't take any, if the replenishment folks were doing it. But again, this is an area you're going to be somewhat limited in terms of the salinity up there where you could move that seed. That's sort of at the upper reaches, and it might be in sort of the lower parts of Area 7. It might not be a comparable salinity as well as parts of the Pocomoke and Tangier Sound. So that's sort of the advantage you get of the Nansman seed, is you can move that more areas, but it might be an option where we could look at maybe that might be more suitable for a load or two to the Potomac tribs up there, and that would take less off of other areas.
Is the state Deepwater Light bottom, hard bottom?
There are some areas harder and there are some areas softer up there. It is most above that hand tong line. The bottom tends to be softer than below it. So it is an area where we would want to be very careful about putting a dredge on it. I'm not sure we'd be ready to make that decision here today without sort of identifying an area and taking a closer look. Off the cuff, I wouldn't say here's the 20 acres we want to work with. These are the boats that are doing this aren't using, you know, they're using big dredges. So we want to be very careful about getting into those areas up there with these larger boats.
Well, are there areas in the seed area that are maybe just barely at the range of too deep to hand tong that there are seed on, or?
No, there are some areas, especially on the edges, but again, these are areas that are softer, and you know, if you're not careful with the dredge, you can take that area down to mud, and it takes a pretty long time for it to come back. So a lot of the areas that are deeper, Horsehead and whatnot, if you get off the rock, you can end up making that rock pretty small. So especially with these larger dredges, so it's a very sensitive area that we, on public ground, really haven't had dredges on for 100 years or so, except maybe I'm not aware of any recent replenishment activity done with dredges in Deepwater Light area.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, let's go.
Andrew, would it be something for staff to look at in the future, maybe a small boat small dredge, you know, if you could isolate any areas that you would be comfortable with. Even if you had, I remember when I was a kid in the dredge seed fishery that used small boats, I think it was a lottery that, you know, you only picked 5 or 10 boats or whatever it was in Great Wacomico or Pianki Tank. It might be something just to think about instead of putting these 6, 8 foot dredges, you know, using a 3 foot or whatever. I mean, with the patent dumps now, it's not a big deal for a small boat to dredge seed.
Well, I think, I guess one of the things that we'd want to be careful as using a smaller dredge potentially, and then looking at these areas, especially the public ground up that area, and a lot of them, we'd want to make sure that if we did take a little too much, that we could get shell back in there. So it's one of those that the other problem that you have benefit if you're a hand tonger is a lot of these areas are pretty shallow, especially deep water light, as you get some areas where some of these bigger boats might not be able to get in there, and if we did need to put shell back, it does require you know, shallower draft boats, and you wouldn't be able to get the larger barges in there, and that's sort of the advantage we've had with moving seed from Nansman Ridge and other areas that have harder bottom, is you're less likely to get down into the mud, and then, you know, we can also replenish these areas. But it is something that we'll have to explore, particularly 15, 20 years from now, if we're getting even lower on hand tongers and running out of these shell deposits, is utilizing areas that actually are producing shells. So I'm not sure I'm ready to commit to
I'm not
anything this time.
advocating for opening the whole upper part of the James. I'm more or less thinking maybe if you and staff isolated 60 acres that you felt comfortable, and whether we had to put shell back or whether whatever, just
Well, that's
to
something-
your point of thinking if we don't have hand tongers to.
I think that's something that I wouldn't be ready to put something on the map today, but we could be directed or requested to do that, and I'm not sure if we could look at it this year, but it's something that we could try to look at, or it could include as an option this year if we do find an area that
Yeah,
staff and VIMS and everyone's comfortable with.
I think that's something that this committee can discuss and maybe take to the commission for further looking into, and maybe down the line we can get into something like that.
Just food for thought.
It is, yeah. But right now, we're at we need a motion to approve or amend or whatever the committee wants to do with what Andrew's presented. Anybody have any ideas of what they'd like to do?
So the proposal would be 15,000 or the 10,000, and it would be the breakdown between the Potomac, Pocomo, and Area 7 and 8 Rappahannock. That
Yeah, we could do, if we wanted, we could do up to 20,000 there, or we could keep it as is, like that. I think staff would support up to 20,000 from that area. But if it stayed at 15, do approximately 7,000 up the Rappahannock and 4 and 4 into Pocomoke and Potomac troops.
So up to 20,000, and then staff would make a decision whether it's 15, 16, 18, or 20, whatever.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a cutoff in the count coming up per bushel?
Yeah, we
There is-
usually try to keep it at over 600. So, you know, ideally we can get over 100 or 1,000, but sort of 600 is about where our cutoff has been.
So is someone on these large boats when they're catching the seed?
Yes,
Do
no.
those counts?
We're keeping at least a close eye on the bushels coming up, and you can tell pretty easily. But we do a initial count with our dredge survey of what the seed is, so we have a per bushel count in these areas based on our dredge survey of what's already there, as well as a patent tong survey. And we have staff, just so everyone is aware, we have staff on these boats for every single load that's caught, and then VMRC staff is tubbing we tub out the dredge and we count every dredge look. And they're on the boats when they're catching the seed, and they're on the boats when these areas are being planted. And last year we instituted requiring our contractors to have a vessel monitoring system on their boats in transit. So we propose doing that again this year, so that when they're working for us, we either are on the boat physically or we're monitoring their vessel where it is. If they're working for themselves or working for someone else, we're not doing that, but if they're working for the state, that's what we started doing last year.
So the 15,000 would come off Aspen Ridge?
From
Not-
those,
Not up the river?
correct, yeah.
Herbert Sadler said for years, and you probably didn't know him, but he said for years that you should never put a dredge up the James River. And he was talking about, I think, V-Rock, Horsehead, and some of these bottoms that are actually on top of mud.
Yeah, those are those areas that once you, I don't even know how the oysters stay there, but once you get through the actual oysters, they're almost floating up there, and those are the areas where we wouldn't want to have any of these dredges be working. I mean, there might be some areas sort of in Jail Island, that area that's sort of sandier bottom that we could look at, but again, those are areas that are traditionally have been more of the clean cull areas. So,
What kind of, you know what kind of counts on Aspen Ridge?
I don't have those numbers offhand, but they're over that 600 threshold, I believe. And in previous years, they've been well into the 1,000, 2,000 plus count when we've had really good spat sets there.
Andrew, how would it work to beta test the vessel monitoring during harvest for these bigger boats for?
Again, it depends a little bit on the system. We were using just a sort of off-the-shelf land, air, and sea magnetic tracker. It's sort of a pay-for cell-based service, so it's not necessarily a hardwired system. But
We've got an opportunity in the conversations I've had with the guys in Maine. I mean, I think they're willing to beta test with us some and work with us on cost and so forth to get started. It's pretty inexpensive to begin with, but just sitting here thinking, and you talking about you're already monitoring, and it might be a good way to test to see how a system like that would work without costing very much money.
No, that's something we can look into, and I think we still have one of those. I don't know. It's probably 10 years old now. Systems that we had on the baler for a while, beta testing, but I know it's come a long
Improved
way.
that. It's that same system, but they've really got the monitoring cost and so forth down. So just
It hasn't been something that I've priced out in the last 2 or 3 years, but I'm sure, like everything electronic-wise, it's one of the few areas where costs are coming down. It seems like.
yeah.
All right, we'll still discussing the seed transfer and a motion for that.
Motion?
Can I ask a question? Is Nominate Creek part of the Potomac that would receive seed under the current proposal? I know there was mention that there's still a lot of small oysters there. I didn't know if that would.
We would probably look at. We did the Yacomico, and it sounded like the Cone might be the area this year. Is that
I think that's right.
okay? That was my understanding. That would be primarily the Cone. Yeah. So that's the furthest down. So maybe we can get a little bit more seed if we're not going all the way up to Nominee, as they say.
So this is essentially, Andrew, what we done last year.
With the exception of instead of playing the Yacomico and the Potomac Tribs, it would be the Cone.
Yeah.
To 20,000.
Yeah, and up to 20,000. We could amend that up to that amount.
Okay. All right. Need a motion?
Need a motion and a second.
I move that they move that Aspen Ridge oysters, what 15,000 to 20,000, whatever you feel comfortable with, what the commission feels comfortable with this year to those areas that you designated to be planted.
All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
And we have a second. Further discussion? Not hearing any. We'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
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 Thank you. All opposed? All right, the motion carries unanimously. Thank you.
All right, and just to be clear, is there any desire to attempt James River seed from the Hantong areas at that price? I don't anticipate we'd get something. I have heard, just so this group knows that Maryland is interested again this year. I'm not sure they're always interested, but I haven't heard anything other than that. So see what happens there. So,
I kind of like the way we did it last year. What did we do? We got ours first, and then after that, what was left, we could send out of state or whatever.
I mean, that's something if it does look like there's focused harvest, the commissioner, without even necessarily any commission action, can close it pretty quickly. So that is, if they do really gear up and it looks like it's damaging the resource, then we can make that call. So we can't, just for the record, we can't close it because we don't want Maryland to have it. We can close it because we don't want them to hurt the resource. So that has to be our reason. So.
Andrew and Adam, I would watch that very closely because as you know, it happens fast when it happens. And
Yeah, and that's something that we're, that call-in system we're monitoring every day. So right now, there's about 55,000 bushels left. Only about 5,000 or so has been caught this year so far. And again, the good news on that is, start talking to our colleagues at VIMS and looking at those harvest numbers, that regardless of if Maryland gears up, there's not going to be that opportunity to catch 120,000 bushels all at once. The most that they're going to be able to catch is at this point, 55,000. So that's what happened in 2017, 2018 timeframe, is none of the fall quota was caught. Maryland got on it really quick. They basically caught 120,000 bushels in the spring and then got right back on it again in the fall and caught another 20 or so thousand, or our folks did as well. So it didn't all go out of state, but that's how we ended up over that 120,000 bushel harvest limit in a single calendar year, and then got hit with a freshet right after that. So
What did you harvest last year by hand tongue in the seed areas?
I don't have that number offhand, but it was, what do you think, Jamie's less than 60,000, probably 40,000 or so was offhand what I would say.
But do you have the hand tongers this year to harvest?
Say again?
Do you have the hand tongers this year to harvest the quota or not?
I don't know. I haven't done a count of how many would be willing to go if there was a market for that seed. So I think it depends on the price. I know that there has been not as many people hand tonguing as there has been in some years, but there have been more people doing market harvest hand tongs in the last 2 years than there have been other years. So it sort of depends on probably market value. But I don't have a good count of how many people, if the price was right, would be willing and able to go hand tonging. I don't have a number of that offhand.
The law did say that you could harvest hand tong through May, right?
That's correct, yeah.
So does the commission still allow through May or just to the end of April?
Through May for seed only is the current
right.
season. Yeah, so the clean cull season right now runs through April, and then seed oysters only through May once you're into the warm weather harvest restrictions there. Were there any other questions before we get on to shell planting here?
I don't think so. Go ahead.
All right. Skip through those. Okay. So shell planting. So again, this is where the majority of the replenishment dollars is going to go. That's that's a very large dredge right there. I think that one you're looking at in that picture can hold over 50 bushels, but that's what's actually used on the seaside for a replenishment program over there. But right now, here's the funding available for this. So again, 600 to 800 acres of shell planting there, primarily replenishment dollars spent there. I actually got okay, there we go. So there we go. So up to 2.5 million in replenishment and 0 to 1.5 in restoration. So we have been able to use some of the fine shells that are sort of a byproduct of our fossil shell mining operation and use those as restoration projects. So we might be able to do some of that if it's again, if it can bring down the total cost of the contract and we can get more large shells by using some restoration funding to buy some of the fine shells. That's something that we have done in the past and we may do this year, depending on how things work with stone availability in those projects. That's why that range is there. and if our contractor is willing to plant those shells, we also can get a credit if they're retained. So that's sort of why that range for restoration funding is there. Again, if there's an opportunity and we have some non-general funds that we didn't use as part of the seed program, that's where that $0 to $70,000 comes in that we would put back into shell planting. And this would include any house shells that are purchased this year would come primarily out of this funding as well. So roughly we probably have, depending on that price range and where we're going and how much, and again, a lot of this we have to put out for bid. That price range of $250 is on the low range, $450 on the high range of what it costs per bushel for shell planting. The Eastern Shore, again, tends to be a little bit higher bushel-wise. These are sort of dredge shells from deposits sort of in the mouths of inlets out there, and this would be primarily with that TNC non-general funds, and then some of that general fund restoration projects. So these are primarily that grant funding from TNC and a small amount of restoration funding to keep that seaside program going. And again, this doesn't support a huge amount of harvest, but a lot of this is restoration funding over there or TNC money. And actually recently TNC has been planting areas that are open to harvest. So that's the funding for that. There's just a actual satellite image of the fossil shell dredge and barge working there. I'm not sure when Google Earth took this, but you can see it from space. And again, as we've seen before, really the goal is to get everything as close or over than 10, but to maintain as many areas as we can at above 5. Again, many of these areas are in better shape than they have been, but these are the areas that were open to harvest this year, and we'd focus on areas that were open to harvest this year that were below that 10-liter threshold, with sort of a focus on areas that were closer to or below that 5-liter threshold. So we try to look at areas that were just recently harvested so we can take advantage of our rotation system to allow recruitment and growth, and then also are targeting areas that are the most in need. And as we do every year, we're trying to plant the most amount of shell for the funding that we have, whether that's dredge shell, reef shell, or house shells. We try to get the most shell we can to the areas that are most in need and sort of that level of priority. And if we get to all those areas this year, I think we'll be able to do a pretty good job of not needing to plant every single area that's close to that 8-liter or more threshold. We can look at potentially expanding some of the areas that we've done in the Rappahannock or Pocomoke last year, but we'll go over there. So again, this is sort of up to 200 acres, primarily in the Pocomoke. I think that Tangier Sound has, most of those areas have not been heavily worked here this season thus far, and most of those areas are at or above that 5 liters, and some of them are at or above that 10-liter threshold. So there's a few areas over there that are sort of at that 8 range, but most of the areas that are in need of shell are actually still areas 9 and 10, and some areas in the Pocomoke, as well as that expanded area, Island Rock. We only planted about half of that last year. It's a pretty big area, and we could look at potentially expanding, since it seems like the Pocomoke has been getting good recruitment, good growth, and most of the fleet's been working there. Most of our shells for this year would be proposed to go to the Pocomoke area for that side of the bay. This is a question for the committee, and we can go through all of it and come back. Blackberry hangs has been planted a couple times in the last 5 or 10 years. I think twice we've put some shell out there. We have sort of anecdotally and also in the field identified some areas where we could look at expanding this. There's a lot of good bottom out there. So that's something that we could, if we get to our priority areas first and we still have some budget left, look at expanding some of the shell plants in blackberry hangs. So that's an option that we've done a little bit of, but we could, given the condition of the resource and the shell base right now, look at making this area a little bit larger. And again, we don't want to go drop 100,000 bushels on an unknown area, but we tend to sort of see where boats are working, talk to the harvesters are working in those areas, and then we go out with our boat and actually survey and sort of feel out those areas, and sort of start small. So that is an option that we could consider as part of this plan this year.
Is the recruitment still good there at Blackberry?
Yeah, it has been very, very good actually. So the last 2-3 years have seen, very good spat set, and on the shell that we did put out there, it was, probably in that 600, 700, 800 count or more per bushel, or in that 300 to 400 spat set range in some of the crabs. So once we got that 10 liters or more shell out there, and we took advantage of those spat sets, it has been pretty consistent in recent years. Actually, a lot of the areas in the lower Great Wicomico and out into Blackberry, this last Pat Tong survey season 2022, we're actually seeing higher recruitment in some of the traditional seed areas upriver.
Andrew, the other thing to consider that I look at there is it's also a management tool. If you take some shell from Rappahannock and go to Blackberry with it, it supports some boats. It actually pulls pressure out of the Rappahannock. So I kind of look at it not only as, an area to increase production, but also as a management tool that you've done a good job spreading these boats out, and this would be a huge area to do that. And I would definitely support planning something up there this year to expand that. And
Okay.
we've got a lot of guys like Mr. Rice that are, very experienced with sort of that area, and I think could spread it out. So I would be very supportive of that.
No, I think that we might be giving you a call to make sure when we're feeling some areas out for expansion that you don't know something we don't. Like there's a big hang right there. Please don't put that. But yeah, that's something that we'll definitely look at this year. Again,
Andrew?
Yep.
I agree with Tommy. It's a big area, but we do have to get somebody like Mr. Rice. We don't want to plant them inshore where all that iron ore is. That's just a waste, but it's a great area to expand and release pressure off everything. I'm all for that. Kind of been my pet peeve to expand Blackberry over the years, so I appreciate you bringing that up.
No, absolutely, and just so folks know, is definitely want the local expertise, but I'm more of a measure twice, cut once, at least when it comes to state funding. So we'll definitely use every tool we have to make sure we're making the most of a limited resource. So definitely talk to Mr. Price and go out there ourselves and make sure that we're on good bottom. And it's always easier to start on good bottom that's marginal rather than start on bad bottom and try to keep working. So for sure. Do you want to take I can go to the end and then take a motion on that as a whole, but that works. But it sounds like there's some consensus for Blackberry there. Again, up to and these are all up to, so we're going to probably resurvey some of these areas that are marginal this spring and make sort of a final call on whether they need shell. Probably area 2, given the amount of boats that are on it right now and the size of the area. We did take not an official resurvey of that area recently, but it has had, as opposed to having 10 to 12 boats as it did earlier in the season after it was extended, it's had, by my count, 39 boats on it. And they've been working till about 10 o'clock in that range. Some boats finishing earlier, but usually when at that point, if they had been getting them in 45 minutes and now they're taking 2 or 3 times longer, it usually means that this area would be potentially needing some shell. This is also an area that we could look at. We already have a permitted site where we've done some smaller stone planting, and we could look at maybe doing some of that again this year. Again, primarily we'd like to do shell, but if we're not able to get all the shell that we need for whatever reason, or if there's some funding available to do it, this is an area that we have planted with smaller stone in the past, and I have heard that it's been producing and seen with my own eyes some pretty good oysters. So this would be that 57 stone chips, but I'll touch on that later in the plan. And then again, we would look at any other areas that were sort of on that borderline, and potentially look at expanding that shell plant that we did off Manaskin Bluff last year up in area 8, sort of just downstream. I'll show it on the map. So roughly this area here, we did about half that area and look at expanding that area a little bit. And we'll take a look at drum and ground just to see. I mean, there might be some areas in the off the inshore side that might be kind of borderline, but you know, if it's at 8 or above and there's still a good layer of brown shell, we likely maybe do real light with some house shell there if we can get some, but wouldn't consider putting a whole barge load or anything up that way.
Drop down to the previous slide of the Rappahannock. One area I would consider staff taking a look at is to the, looking into Carter's Creek to the right of the mouth. Come on down to Weems, where it says Weems.
Oh, in
Yeah,
here?
yeah, right in that area offshore, right about where you're at there, to consider. I don't think we've planted that, but it was there were 5 or 6 boats. Wayne, you probably saw them working in that area, and they did fairly well there. So it may be a site that you could look at increasing production in Area 4.
Okay, no, that's something that you know,
Really
when we
good bottom.
when we have these, it's nice to finally be not behind the 8 ball on all these, so to be able to start expanding the program. I noticed there's that area there, and there's an area that we don't survey off of, we call it Bush Park there in Area 2, that had a right good number of boats that's sort of off a little bit of a deeper spot that we have a mark on, but we haven't actually laid out a spot that we could potentially look at. Again, if everything lines up and need a shell and whatnot. But again, up to, go ahead there.
Hey, Andrew, what's that area there at Tolles Point? Back to your down, over to the right.
Right here?
There, yeah, is that?
That's a
that's
sanctuary.
That's what
That's
I thought,
correct,
yeah.
yeah.
I thought you were listing it as a public part of drumming ground.
No, these are actually, just so everyone's aware, these are all the areas that we have either planted, most of them have planted or built or are surveyed in the Rappahannock. So
Okay.
these are, you know, all the, you know, here's drum and ground,
Right, east and west, yeah.
offshore, inshore, Ferry Rock, you know, Parrots, Broad Creek down that way. So these are all the areas that we actually survey. But here's what we call, you know, Bush Park here, Mosquito over there. But anyway, so that's all the areas that are surveyed there in the Rappahannock. But these wouldn't be all the areas that we get planting, just sort of give you an overview of these areas. Again, just the upper areas. This was where we talked about Manaskin and Maratico. The shell that we did plant last year on Manaskin and Maratico, I mean, I'm sure folks who've been working up there have seen it, but the spat set in the upper Rappahannock has been the highest ever that we know of. I mean, we do a dredge survey that goes all the way up to Ross Rock there, just below the bridge, and we saw more spat that we've seen up there since VIM's data goes back to 1947. So, you know, that's if everything goes well up there, that's something that 2-3 years from now is going to be a lot of oysters, and it's always a little bit of a gamble to plant shell up that far, whether you're going to get a good strike, but we hit the winning numbers on it this year anyway. So.
And all the spat was very, very small. It hadn't been too long and struck.
Yeah.
This was in December. So it was September, probably October, and it was just and inside the shells, you know, just a tremendous amount of very, very small spat.
No, there were some pockets, and I'm sure folks have seen them in some of the deeper edges in 4 and likely up here as well, that did have some mortality. But the good news is those oysters, one oyster died and it's got 50, 60, 70 spat inside of it. So it's not going to be an oyster you can get next year, but it's a shell we don't have to plant, and hopefully that's one oyster turning it into 15. So that's, I know no one likes to see oysters die, but that's kind of how they work. I mean, the big ones die and the new ones grow on the corpses of their dead relatives. But
Andrew, did they strike on the inside because the outside is dirty or whatever?
Well, if you're culling them quick, you might not see all the ones that are struck on the outside, but they don't have a strong preference. But a lot of times they're not subject to as much predation, so mud crabs and croaker and everything else that eats them, they're more protected on the inside.
Okay.
But when they're that big and they're on the outside, they're also a lot easier to see on a clean shell on the inside. And this was a question that we had last year, and there was a resounding no, at least from the Tangier side, but Mobjack wasn't open this rotation season. These are good areas. the committee made the decision not to replant them after the last time they were opened. These areas are, scheduled to be in the rotation, not this next go-around, but a year from now. Just wanted to pose a question if the committee would like to consider planting any shell in these areas again this year. They are, of the rotation areas, the most in need of shell. They're both below that 5-liter threshold. This committee had some concerns about planting shell, and I wanted to see if they still had those concerns. Again, these are areas that have gotten very good spat sets, but they haven't resulted in high level of market harvest. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but when they were opened last year, after we had removed about 10,000 bushels from these areas, it did hold 10 to 12, 15 boats in that range for a pretty good long while. So even after removing 10,000 bushels, there were very good sized number of market oysters, more so than there had been in previous rotations, even after we'd taken that 10,000 bushels off of this area. So it is a good recruitment area. It is good bottom. It has had some concerns.
If we remove 10,000 more, you think it'll even get better?
No. Well, I think, like I showed you that grab in the first slide, that was from one of these areas, sort of after we'd seen that harvest activity.
What kind of counts and stuff do they have there now? Do you have anything on that?
It's not nearly as good as it was in the center of the rock, and there's probably some areas kind of off around the edges that are pretty good, but I don't think we would get the same amount of seed off of these areas as we did before, and we'd still be able to have that harvest season. It didn't have, since we didn't have any fresh shell, and it is sort of below that 5-liter threshold. It didn't get a good spat set this year, so it got those really good spat sets right after we planted it. Counts in the thousands, and then by the time 2 years later, they weren't there anymore.
Maybe we could put some shell on it again, and if we have problems again, we could just go back to do the same thing.
I mean, it is an option for an area that it can be planted. If it gets a good spat set, we could move it, but if it doesn't and the shell's there, there's no guarantee. So it's
traditionally a slow growing day also. Yeah.
Traditionally, there doesn't seem to be a lot of market oysters that show up there. So they have grown. This year there were some market oysters there, but they actually looked pretty good this last go around. There were some larger oysters there, but it tends to not produce market oysters.
So Andrew, what's the deal with Browns Bay? I call it Browns Bay. What do y'all call it? Deep Rock or something?
No, that's where'd my mouse go? This is a closed harvest area there, so we've had a number of
I know it's closed, but I mean, why is it closed?
Well, we try to keep a balance of harvest and sanctuary areas in all of our areas, and that's been an area where we've been able to use some restoration funding.
So it's a sanctuary?
It's a sanctuary, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that explains it.
Yeah, so it has had some shell plantings in the past, and is an area that sort of we've been monitoring to kind of compare what's going on in the harvest areas there.
Mr. Chairman.
In your presentation, Andrew, on my object, I mean, for me, you answered it for me. I mean, you said it several times. This is an area that we don't usually get any markets out of. And to that, I say, what's the point? That's just my opinion. Everybody knows how I feel about this. And it's the same way. We don't get our bang for our buck putting money there. Put the money, I mean, in the same area. It's not like if York River would suit better, or put that money somewhere else, is the way that I feel.
Well, the good news on the York River, and I think we'll probably be discussing that hopefully here pretty soon, is that it hasn't had a lot of pressure and is in pretty good shape. There are some areas that I don't know if, again, we'd be ready to plant shell this year at them, that we could start looking at in some of those rotation areas in New York that we don't plant. I guess there's a locally known rock as Anchor Hall, sort of on the north end of Timber Neck, that does hold some boats sometimes. And there are some sort of more offshore, larger lumps sort of around some of those beacons that we don't plant at. So we could look at in the future maybe expanding some of those areas as well. Again, we don't have them keyed in on. I sort of know in my mind where I've seen the boats, and we haven't thoroughly surveyed and identified all those areas, but that might be an option to look at in the future.
Well, I just don't see the point in keep planting. What was the point in dredging it up if we're just going to plant it again? I mean, we dredged it up because it was producing nothing. Well, you might not get a strike. Why? I mean, I don't. What's the point of keeping putting money there? That's my point. I mean, it's been said over and over with the strike that's been put there, or the strike that's been seen there, and it's no market comes off of it. So I don't know. That's just my opinion.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Kellum.
I would agree with Dan. We've been down this road for 15 years, and I would rather see staff put the shells on Nansemond Ridge or more and just take more seed from Nansemond or somewhere that we're assured we're going to get a better return. I think it's a reason it's below 5 liters, and that's been a issue since I've been on this committee, since the oysters have come back and I've been on this committee. So I tend to agree with Dan, and my comment would be just to move on.
I don't think I need a motion on that, but we can move on. So again, there's a lot of ground in the James River. Everyone knows it's a big river. I think in terms of the areas that we're looking at planting now, we might have a budget for up to 250,000 bushels. Most of the effort has been sort of on the Newport News side, so Thomas's Brown Shoal. There has been a few boats down, sort of below the bridge there, working on cruisers and High Shoal, and about 12 or so boats working on Nansemond, and a few in Nansemond proper here and there. But sort of these areas are where most of the 30 to 40 boats are most days. Conveniently for us are also the areas that are deeper. When you get into Ballard's Marsh and Upper Dog and Lower Dog, they're kind of tricky to plant. I don't know. Vernon left, but he can tell you some stories. So these were the areas that we'd focus on, and again, these are pretty big areas. Not all of these areas would get planted. We typically do resurvey most of the lower James before we do any shell planting, so we could take a look and see which of these areas are the most in need. And as discussed before, Nansemond Ridge is one of the areas where we can put a lot of shell for relatively inexpensive. It has been getting really good sets. We can look at replanting the areas that we remove seed from, and potentially even, again, like we've done, doing some lighter planting on Nansemond Ridge proper and leaving that alone for the folks that do harvest there. And just so folks know, is we try, when we're out there, because staff is out there on the boats, is we do understand that when we're moving seed, we're trying to move seed, not market oysters. So we try to, if we're getting into an area where there's mostly large oysters, in one of our older shell plants, we try to keep the boats working on areas where they're getting higher count seed rather than moving markets from one place to another. So we try to not do that. But again, this is where we'd likely be able to put a pretty significant amount of shell. So that's shell planting. I think I got a pretty good idea of the committee's desires on that. But is there any concerns or comments on or official motions on that? I don't need one unless there wants to be one. But if there's anything you don't like, we'd like to take that forward. Yeah.
Would be all right, John, kind of just to, instead of a motion, give you a consensus on this, and then we can, as we go forward, maybe, before the September meeting or whenever it is, we need to decide on all this. At one of our next meetings, we can come up with a motion for this when you have it all the way you want it.
Well, this will be heard in February, so this plan is gonna, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So you want a motion?
Yeah, we can wait till the end unless there's anything on this and save talk. I'm almost done with this part.
Okay,
so.
we'll do it that way then.
So that was shell planting, unless there's any more comments or discussions on that. But alternative substrate is going to be pretty quick. So this is stone, for lack of a better word. We have done plantings with crushed concrete and construction rubble and coal ash and toilet bowls and all sorts of stuff, but we pretty much figured out that the easiest thing, the best thing to work with, that you have the least issues with, is good old granite stone. So all of our alternative substrate planting this year is stabilized coal ash, just for the record, not actual coal ash, it was stabilized coal ash. Just wanted to make sure I clarified for folks there. But all of the plantings this year would be quarry stone. There's a number of local quarries that we've worked with. We do source some stone from up the bay, but good, clean, washed quarry stone is what we're talking about here. The new money, mostly restoration funding, so there's some grant funding in there, but mostly that $1.5 million, that's a little typo, I need to correct that. Mostly the general funds for restoration there would go towards stone. And then we already have, as I sort of touched on earlier, a number of sites that are permitted in harvest areas. So if we have an issue with the shell dredge, we could shift to some stone planting. We have an area permitted, sort of a sandier, harder area with lower densities of oysters in the lower James River near Nansman Ridge. We have a number of areas permitted in the lower Rappahannock, Area 2 and Area 1. We have another area permitted off Deep Rock, which doesn't really need any shells these days. And then we have another area permitted over in the Pocomoke near Onancock. So those are options that we could look at. And if need be, try to get more areas permitted if something catastrophic happens and we can't get shell for whatever reason, we look at expanding it. But at this point, we don't anticipate it. That's why you see that zero number. But those are the dollar amounts for restoration and replenishment for stone. Most of the restoration projects were already approved last year. That's where that grant funding came from. We have approved, we're in the permitting process now for areas in the lower Mob Jack, so away from these harvest areas. Going to be a combination of larger, more harvest-resistant stone. And then in subsequent years, we're going to likely get into some sort of near call it near coastal or intertidal shell plants to sort of stabilize some of the marshes that are publicly owned in these areas. So that's where that new funding is going to go. But this year it's going to go to deeper stone plants in this area. And again, it's part of that sort of that matching funding going along with that grant application that we approved last year. And that's where we're going to put our rocks this year. So shell and rocks. So were there any questions on any of that?
You got a question?
Nope.
Excuse me. All right, well, I guess we work on motions, so I'll ask the committee for a motion to approve or to amend, adjust, or whatever you'd like to do.
I'll make a motion, we approve the plan that Andrew discussed.
I have a motion.
Second it.
I have a second.
I have a question.
Okay.
Are we, in that plan, was that including expanding blackberry hang on shells? Can you clarify that?
Yes, we'll look at doing that. I think that would be if the committee, unless they say otherwise, if we get the priority areas planted, that look at doing that. So yes to that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we have a motion.
Okay, thank you.
We have a second. Further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Thank you. Opposed?
Mr. Chairman, I'd abstain, and I'd like to state publicly that our company, Kellen Brothers, will probably take part in some of this restoration activity.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. All right, we have one abstention. We have all the rest yes. Any noes? Hearing none, motion passes. Thank you.
All right, we saved 10 minutes for the Rex part, but no, we can go longer with that if need be. But I think that's that. Is there ready to move on to the next agenda item if you
Yes,
are?
sir.
So. All right. So I think I captured the consensus from SMAC the last go around on the season extensions. I don't have a whole lot more to add on to this. I just want to say that there had been some discussion about the need to shift harvest two areas to improve the areas where more harvest is going on, and VIMS is here too, but I think just want to be clear that the scientific consensus is that harvesting more oysters from an area isn't good for that area long term. So if you're scraping and dredging area, what you might see is it's going to be easier and quicker to catch more oysters with a dredge or a scrape, but you're not making more oysters and you're not making more oyster reef. So just so folks are clear that that's the science on dredging is it's not good for oysters. Harvest in general isn't good for oysters, but you can do it in a less damaging and a sustainable way if you're keeping things spread out like we have been. So just wanted to put that out there. But these are the areas that were discussed last go around. I think I've captured them here. What the consensus was, I believe, was 10 working days added in the following areas. So it would be the Tangier Sound rotation area, so not the Pocomoke Sound area. The Blackberry Hangs area, which is scheduled to close the end of this month. The Great Wacomico area, which closed, but then could reopen for that same period. Again, a 10 working day extension is 14 calendar days. The Patentong area, one in the Rappahannock, and would be, again, a 10 working day extension. And then the Deep Rock area would be another 10-day extension, and as well as the York River hand scrape area, and all of the Hantong areas that are set to close March 31st. So I believe that was the discussion at the last SMAC meeting. Staff would be supportive of no more than that and no additional areas on top of these. I think there has been a lot of discussion and a lot of calls from many folks working in the Pocomoke Sound area. This is the area that I think Don mentioned had 60 or 70 boats working in.
No. Area 9 is what they wanted to.
Right.
That's only had a few boats. I mean, when Area 9 was open in Area 10, boats went there the first day. Everybody was right back down to Shell Rock the next day. Area 9 and 10, Area 9 hasn't been worked hardly in at all. Area 10 was worked in November. But there's only like 3 or 4 boats up there that's been working now, and they would like to have an extension on that for 10 days. I mean, you got enough calls, and and that's not a consideration.
Well, I think that I did my best to try to call all 20 or 30 people that called me yesterday morning back yesterday afternoon and had an individual conversation with all of them. But I think the concern that I expressed to them and the concern that I'll share with the committee now is areas 9 and 10 are areas that, even with the seed planting and the shell planting that we've done, are on a whole on that below 10 in that 5 to 8 range right now in terms of the actual amount of shell and oysters there. So there are good areas, but they're kind of patchy. These areas are very shallow and hard to plant. And the sort of concern that I have is, how many boats did you say were tied up in Saxis?
51 in Saxes. Now, it's in the harbor. Now, I understand where you're coming from there. I understand.
Right. So the concern is that these areas, if this area is extended and there isn't other areas for those 51 boats to go to, that you end up with up to maybe 51 boats, especially the smaller boats, on top of these areas that we've spent a lot of money, moved seed to try to get back. And then that potentially takes away an option for having this season again in November next year, or having a month cover in February if the weather is bad, so those boats can work next year when they might not be able to work every single day. We've had a pretty good year this year. I think doesn't sound like anyone's missed maybe more than a day or two due to weather anywhere. I know we had one cold snap, and I think a few folks maybe couldn't get out of a creek there right around Christmas, but for the most part, it's been a pretty mild winter, and I think that staff probably wouldn't support that extension there, but it gives us an option for next February, maybe next November. Something does happen in the Pocomoke and goes the other way, it's always good to have that resource available. And again, that's an area that if it's really good next year and you get a really bad weather window out there in the Pocomoke where it is blowing, the boats can't go out there. That gives you another option. So I think that's the
Are
main
you,
reason in there.
are you considering opening them 9 and 10 possibly next year?
I think we could look at potentially doing that, depending on maybe a short season. Again, there's no set rotation in those areas. We have been opening it concurrently with Shell Rock to take some pressure off of it. Again, I'm not sure there's going to be a need for it, but maybe a 2-week season in November like we did again this year. But again, that gives you more of an option. Wouldn't want to commit to anything now per se, but see how things are looking, see how this season goes, see where we get shell, where we get seed, and go from there.
The only thing on 9 is I'd like to see some boats up there turning shells over. We can't get shells up there, we know that. And the seed is better than nothing, don't get me wrong, but it's just not enough. I'd like to see those shells cleaned, try to clean them, and maybe get a spat set up there. That's what we need.
Well, I guess you need shells to turn over, is part of the problem. So there's
Well,
not.
we got shells to turn over. Now, what they'll do once we turn them over is yet to be seen. But if we can't get shells there, then the only alternative I see we got is try to clean the shells up that are there if we can't get anything to plant. I mean, you can't keep running seed. The seed did not turn out as good, to be honest with you, as we thought it would. There was one place there they caught their lemon hand tongue, and when Jury planted Lonnie planted the first 2 loads on Beasley's there, that wasn't that good. He told me that on the radio, and it really fooled everybody, to be honest with you. But then again, Shell Rock was so good. I don't know, they asked for it. I'm here, I'm asking, and that's all I can do.
No, and it's I
And
mean,
I understand where you're coming from, for 60-some boats on it. That's not good either, right? Well, I don't know, got different opinions on it, but anyway.
well, and I think it's one of those areas that if we do get some more seed up there, we can keep making those areas better. It's more of an option, and we do. This is an open invitation to everyone on the committee. Is when we do these surveys to come out and try to give you as much advance notice as we can, but we don't always have a good weather window, especially coming over your way. So sometimes it's the last minute. But when you actually take not on all areas, but when you take an actual patent grab on some of these areas that we haven't been able to get up top of the shallow areas, there literally isn't. There's no black shell turnover. It's just there's a few patchy oysters here and there, and turning those over isn't going to help anything. It's just going to break them up and turn them more into black shell. So there's just not that base there. It's good bottom to hold shell. It's kind of that cinders mixed with sand, mixed with mud, mixed with sort of shell hash. But there's not good big shells to turn over and bring back up to catch a set in a lot of these areas. But other than that addition, go ahead there.
Andrew, just want to clarify things a little bit here. So James River, York River, and Rappahannock Area 2, they'll all close on the 24th?
The York River is, we're talking about the hand scrape areas are actually scheduled to close the end of this month. So
Or
they would
end of
close.
February, okay. So that
Yep.
wasn't on the emergency,
The emergency extension, just to clarify, folks, was for Rappahannock Area 2 through the 24th,
Yep.
and James River hand scrape areas 1, 2, and 3 through the 24th.
So that
those were the 2 areas.
stands, right.
Those would stay closing on the 24th. So they were talking about just areas, with the exception of Pocomoke 9 and 10 and Pocomoke 2 and a few other areas scheduled to close, extending those areas by 10 working days.
okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
And I support this, but on, say, Blackberry Hang or Great Wacomica, if you guys get a call that, say, Mr. Rice calls and says there's 60 boats up here and this won't stand it, you would be in a position to work with the commissioner and get this closed pretty quickly if you had that sort of issue?
I think we can try to keep a close eye on that. There's never a guarantee it'll happen, but I think if one of these areas suddenly does look like it's getting that much of an extension, hopefully people kind of stay a little bit where they are. But if everyone who's working in Rappahannock right now goes to Area 4 rather than half to the York, and that could be a concern there.
It's a few of them will go Patton, but it's gonna be a lot of scrape boats, looking for work, yeah.
Just, I have heard a concern from Mr. Rice was one, but just some of the watermen that we have some kind of, everyone's in favor of this, but just have some kind of matrix that if one day we wake up, we saw that in Blackberry Hang, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, and just have, an eye on it that we can close it pretty quickly if we need to.
We can attempt to, try to get that through, and just so we're clear, I mean, a lot of the season that we already passed before these additional extensions was an extension from last year. So when this committee met and the commission met, we sort of baked in extending the season again because of the condition of the resource. So we stretched some of these areas out, the James River, some of the Patton areas. Typically the James River has had a 3-month season. We'd experimented before with kind of stretching it out a little bit, but this year a 4-month season is a pretty long time. But again, one of the reasons we've been able to do that is by keeping the fleet split up like we have. So none of these areas have had really more than, I think the Pocomoke has probably had the most boats consistently over there, but in years past, half those boats might have been over in the Rappahannock. So,
And the other part of that, in our August meeting, we talked about not raising limits and to be able to do this and using your numbers of number of boats in the, in the James River. If you had looked at just 2 bushels, increase, and we wouldn't be way far off from what we're at by extending. So I think it was sound management, and it's allowed us to do these extensions.
and just so folks kind of know, raw number-wise is likely if these extensions are approved, we're going to have about 50% more harvest this year than we did last year.
Wow,
So
that's
we're
great.
looking at almost 100,000 bushel increase in the number of oysters coming off of market ground, likely based on sort of where we're at right now compared to years past. And that'll be the highest harvest since 1987, 88, coming off of public ground. Not saying it happened. There was a whole lot of other stuff going in, but after 1987, 88 season, we didn't see over 200,000 bushels for 25 years. But a lot of that was related to disease.
Andrew, let me be clear on this, if you will. Are you speaking of adding 10 days starting the 1st of March or adding 10 days starting the 27th of February?
It's going to be 10 working days. So
10 working days, yes.
yeah.
But what is the start date?
Right now, I think that season would end on the 14th of March for those 10 working days. So I don't have a calendar here in front of me, but I think.
But so it would start on the 1st of March then?
Yep, on the 1st. Yep.
Okay, right. And you are including, the staff supports opening Tangier Sound, leaving Tangier Sound open, which would be Thoroughfare, I think, the main rock there.
Yeah, I think staff is going to support no more than that extension. I think that generally in the past, seasons have been extended for emergency reasons or the resource weather conditions. This is an extension that's for more resource to be harvested, so we're not necessarily in favor of a hard extension, but I think that no more than 10 days we could handle, I guess, is sort of the staff opinion.
I think Dan can speak to Tangier pretty well. I mean, what I hear is that there have not been many oysters caught off Thoroughfare this year, that a lot of oysters are left there. They are
it's getting a few more boats on it now. We're probably up to 10, maybe. I guess it's 10, but I don't know, maybe 10 or 11 boats now. And Cali hasn't had any work at all. And I think the 10 days is, we're following with the 10 days. I mean, I think I said this in the last meeting, that you go past the 10 days, you get into the crabbing season, and not so much Thurfer as it is Kiali. That can be a hot spot for crabbing, and that could be a bad mess. And I think we're fine with the 10 days. I'd be willing to back up, Don's suggestion. If Don, with area knowing, I don't support Area 2 into Pocomoke Sound. I think that needs to be, I know there's still plenty of oysters there, but I keep going back to 4 years ago. You couldn't even make a living over there. We spent a lot of money in seed and shells. I don't want to see it get back to that. That's got worked hard. I think we've had 3 very good months, or it'll be 3 very good months over there, and I just think sometimes it might just be time. It looks different now over there. I went over there Monday, where it was bad weather. Still very good. We would have loved to have had that 4 years ago, but it's getting a different look to it now. But the area now hasn't been worked much, and I'll leave that more up to Don. He asked for it, but I haven't. I think the last time I went in Sexes and sold oysters was last Monday or Tuesday. It looked like to me 3 boats was up there. So it's not like it's not got worked at all. But if it leaves it open for next year, I'll follow Don's suit on that.
Well, I'm gonna have some ornery people, but I've had them before. Everybody wants 9 open up because we got a lot of small boats. They can't go to Tangier Sound. Well, Dan knows that you're risking your life when you go there when it's blowing, and we've only got 10 working days. You'd be lucky to get 5 with a small boat if you get that. That's why I'd like to see it open up the whole month. But even up until crab season, when's that, Dan, 17th?
17th.
Even up till the 16th, that gives you, 2 extra days? Don't sound like much, but it's money. I feel they're concerned. They just don't want to go to Tangier Sound, and I don't blame them. I've got a big boat, I can go. They asked me to bring it up, and it's like Mike Clare when he called you, and nobody asked for a extension, and now they're all up thinking they're going to get one because nobody called, and then when he called you, so I don't, Ty knows what's going on.
What are they asking? Is it just Nowing they're asking for, Don? Is it Nowing, or is it Shell Rock, or is it what is it?
No. Just asking for 9. I told them Shell Rock was 8. A lot of them don't like that, but they did want 9.
Well, I'd heard from both camps. So some people have been asking for the whole Pocomoke.
Oh, yeah,
some 9, some 10, some a month, some 10 days. So
9. You can ask for what you want, but you gotta sometimes give in. Everybody's asked me for 9. I'm like Dan with 10. We've done good, and there's still plenty of oysters there. Don't get me wrong, plenty. People are getting their limit at 8:30. Some was at 8 o'clock, and
That's good.
9 just bothers me because we can't get shells up there, and we put seed there, but you can't keep. I guess you can keep running seed up there, but I would like to see it. I'd like to see the shells cleaned up. You know what I'd like to see? Get a place up there and pay somebody to pull bagless dredges for about 2 weeks. One small place, and go back and look at it.
Well,
if you get a spat set on it, that tells me it needs to be worked.
Well, I guess we can talk more about that, but we've done that experiment with bagless dredging, and it
Well, Maryland did it, and it was.
They don't do it anymore.
They done good.
They don't do it anymore in Maryland. Really.
They don't have to. They got plenty of oysters. Got $9 million from the state.
Well, I think what has worked and what Maryland has moved to, and we've done is if you do get shell that's actually sunk, is not just doing bagless dredging, but if there's areas that one of the boats can actually dredge them up, put them on deck, and wash them off again, that works a lot better than just sort of turning them over on the
Oh,
bottom.
yeah, oh, yeah, I agree with that.
That's what we've done on Bird and Marshalls when some of those areas sunk, and that worked out a lot better than just sort of churning up the bottom in the dredge, which Maryland's done, we've done, and it's more of a work program for watermen than actually doing anything is basically what it comes down to in terms of the actual science when you go back to these areas, especially if you're doing it at the wrong time of year, especially if you're doing it on an area where there's no shell. So I'm not saying it can't work, but I'm saying in 9 and 10 where there's no shell, you can't make shell with a dredge.
No,
if it's
but
not
I
there.
know some guys up there that dredge the good rocks with the dredge. I mean, you can't go out there with a bagless dredge and pull it for 2 days. You gotta steady clean the shells up. You gotta do it at the right time of year too. And they done for them. I always thought the ghost potting deal was the worst thing this state ever done.
Well,
They should have hired the crab dredgers to pull bagless dredges on oyster rocks. But anyway, that's another that. Go ahead, go on.
Well, Andrew, I'm in with Irie now, and it was supposed to be open. It's the set date on that was the whole month of February. The first day it got some work, but the all of a sudden it was better, and everybody come back down below on area too. The most boat, and Don can answer this better than I can, but going in there selling oysters, 3 boats is the most I've seen.
It hasn't been worked. It hasn't been worked, Dan. The first day.
And I mean, if you were following with it with the month being open, and I'm not saying even 10, shut 10 down. 10 got worked in November. I mean, just if it's something that the boys can have up there. I mean, if you were following with the month, what's wrong with the 10 days?
And here's something else too, Andrew. A lot of boys have told me they're not even going in town as you're saying. They're getting their pots rigged up. They're going crabbing on the 17th. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's going to be 60, 50, 60 boats up there, because I don't think there are. Some like Dan would rather catch a crab 10 to 1 than an oyster, wouldn't you, Dan?
Well, yeah, I'm getting it in this warm weather. If I don't get it in your bones, you probably.
I mean, I'm telling you, a lot of those
I
guys.
am going to do the extent, not the full extension, but I am going to do some of it. But I don't know. I understand we're not. I usually don't say a whole lot about 9 and 10. I usually let Don dictate that because it don't really affect us that much. But I can feel for some of them. I don't know. I mean, it's not been worked. I mean, if it was fine for a month, I don't know why 10 days, I mean, would be a problem. And it is, what am I missing, Andrew?
Well, I guess, having it open for that whole month and having it overlap, I guess, was the intention, I think, of staff to make sure that every boat in Saxis that wanted to catch oysters wasn't on 9 or 10. So that was because those areas aren't yet as in good a shape as Shell Rock. To at least take a few boats off Shell Rock for part of it, and then if something did happen, to still have an area where folks could catch some oysters in the small boats in February. So that's sort of the reason is we assumed, knowing going into this, that Shell Rock was going to be good. It's always hard to predict exactly where boats go. So
Right.
Again, we don't know next month, but we do know that if Shell Rock's closed, probably 30, 40 boats are probably going to be in a much smaller area that isn't in as good condition for 14 days. And that's an area that it's taken 4 or 5 years to get back up to where it is now. And that if we do that, there's a chance that next year the weather might not be very good, and particularly in February, and we might need an area like this to have as an option, or the year after that. And given that it's so hard to plant, we've already had a really good season, and we're risking potentially not having an area like that as an option going forward is the main reason.
All right. I get I do. I understand where you're coming from.
And I mean, I get it too. It's definitely. I mean, there's no denying that an extra week of oyster season is $500,000 to $800,000 in dockside value coming across the dock. So every single week is a lot of money for a lot of hardworking people.
Is
I understand
that area slated to open would 9 be open traditionally next year?
There hasn't really been a set rotation on these areas.
You said that
It's been every
earlier,
2 years.
You know, we have opened parts of them here and there, but usually we like to try to give an area a rest. But we've had it open
The
for
last-
2 months before and have done a
The
month
last time
here
it
and
was
there.
open with Shell Rock, and 9 and 10 were open in February. And this year, we opened up 10 for 2 weeks in November.
And I know you and I had talked, and some other folks had talked about maybe trying to have a different rotation area coming in to try to get,
Yeah.
you know, some boats moved
Yeah.
around a little bit, and 9 and 10 can work into that option. So it might be something, next year you could maybe have part of Beasley Bay open along with 9 and 10. Maybe that would be an option. So again, more oysters gives you more options, but if you catch them now, we likely wouldn't open it next year. It would stick with the same rotation, and it might not be as good as it would be if we did open it next year, or if we waited 2 years and then Shell Rock didn't recover from what happened to it this year, or small oysters, who knows? So it's just one less option you have going forward, and these are areas that, again, are more expensive and harder to replenish and not as in good shape as the areas that we are extending.
So you would consider 5?
What's that?
Already did. All right, get on with it, so we all can get home.
All right. No, I
I've
mean,
tried,
and
Dan.
I think I talked, I at least called back to just about everybody, and they were very nice to me. So I think they
Yeah.
understood what I was saying, and I understood what they
Yeah,
were saying.
they're
So,
coming around.
no hard feelings over there, and I'm glad everyone's had such a good season.
Yeah.
So do we need a motion on this, or?
If SMAC wants to bring this version forward, staff will bring that as a committee recommendation to the commission this February. Again, the staff recommendation is likely going to be no more than 10 working days, but we'll bring
For what's on the screen?
for what's on the screen, yeah.
Mr. Kellum?
I would make a motion to support staff recommendation and no more than 10 days with what we see here.
All right, we have a motion.
I'll second it.
Okay.
We have a second. Any further discussion on this? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
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 Thank you. Chairman says aye also. Passes unanimously. Thank you, Andrew. Now we're on to other business. But before I get to other business, I would like to ask if anybody in the audience has anything they would like to bring up or come to the podium and talk about. Thank you. Hearing none, we'll go to other business. Does anybody have any other business they'd like to bring up or discuss? Yes, Mr. Cowan.
Just food for thought for a future SMAC meeting. I would like to make a motion that we have a very holistic discussion about the Rappahannock and a possible 2-year rotation, and sort of revisit what we talked about in the Worcester Heritage Program that was, I think, 19 years ago that we were going to do this exercise I'm asking for in 3 years, and, you know, some 16 years later, it hadn't been done, so.
All right, you're making that as a motion.
I would like to make it a motion and get it on record that we have a discussion about the Rappahannock, I'll call it a strategy discussion.
All right, we have a motion. Everybody heard Mr. Kellum's motion. Do we have a second on that?
Second.
All right, we have a second also. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
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 Chairman votes aye as well. That passes unanimously. Thank you, Mr. Kellum. Any other business? Yes, ma'am.
I'd also like to request maybe at the next meeting, if we could get an update on Rex Shoals.
Sure, yeah.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. What was that? She wanted to know about Rex Shoals, some information about Rex Shoals. All right, do you have anything else, Andrew?
I think that's everything that I have on the agenda. I appreciate everyone making the trip over, down, across.
You're welcome. I'd like to thank you gentlemen on the phone for participation. I'd like to thank law enforcement for being here, our friends from VIMS, staff, and all those other gentlemen that are here. Thank you all for coming, and meeting is adjourned.
All right, see y'all. Thank you.